Scene: wide aerial shot of the English countryside at dawn. Green rolling hills stretch to the horizon. Morning mist clings to the valleys. A small stone cottage sits alone beside a stream, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. Birdsong. The camera descends slowly, moving toward the cottage. Soft, melancholic strings begin to play. 200 years ago, the homes people lived in told a story that most history books have forgotten. Not a story of kings or empires or battlefield glory, but of ordinary families, people with calloused hands and tired backs, and children who played barefoot in the mud, whose entire world was about to be torn apart by the largest transformation humanity had ever seen. How Industrial Revolution homes looked 200 years ago is not just a question of architecture or design, it is a question of survival, of dignity, of the human cost of what we now call progress. In the year 1820, England was a nation standing on the edge of something enormous, though most of its people did not yet understand what was coming. In the countryside, in the small villages scattered across Yorkshire, Lancashire, Derbyshire and beyond, families still lived much as their grandparents and great-grandparents had lived before them. The rhythms of life were tied to the seasons, to the land, to the ancient patterns of sowing and harvest, of birth and death, of work done by hand and rest, earned by exhaustion. The Hargrave family of West Yorkshire was one such family. Thomas Hargrave was 34 years old in the spring of 1820, a broad-shouldered man with hands roughened by decades of working wool. He was a weaver, as his father had been, and his father's father before that. The craft had been passed down through generations, like an inheritance more valuable than land or money. The knowledge of how to turn raw fleece into cloth, how to read the tension of the threads, how to make the shuttle fly with a rhythm that was almost musical. Their cottage stood at the end of a narrow lane, a quarter-mile from the village of Thornfield. It was built of rough-cut Yorkshire stone, the same grey stone that made up the drystone walls, running across the moors in every direction. The walls were nearly 2 feet thick, built to withstand the fierce winds that howled across the hills in winter. The roof was thatched with reeds, gathered from the banks of the River Calder, and it needed rethatching every few years, a task that Thomas undertook himself with the help of his neighbours. The floors were packed earth on the ground level, worn smooth and hard by generations of feet, and rough-hewn oak planks on the upper floor, creaking with every step. Scene: the camera moves inside the cottage. Morning light streams through a small window with thick, uneven glass. A woman, Mary, stirs a pot over the hearth. 3 children sit at a wooden table. The oldest boy reads from a tattered book. The youngest girl plays with a rag doll. Everything is simple, worn, but clean. The cottage had 2 rooms on the ground floor, and 1 large room above, reached by a steep wooden staircase barely wide enough for Thomas's shoulders. The main room served as the kitchen, the living space, and the heart of the household. A large stone hearth dominated one wall, blackened by years of peat and wood fires. A cast-iron pot hung on a chain above the flames, and the smell of porridge or boiling vegetables was a constant presence, mixing with the faint scent of lanolin from the wool that was always somewhere in the house. The walls were whitewashed with lime once a year, usually in spring, and decorated with nothing more than a wooden cross and a small shelf holding Mary's few treasured possessions, a chipped teapot that had belonged to her mother, a bundle of dried lavender, and a Bible with a cracked leather cover. Thomas's wife, Mary, was a woman of quiet strength. She was 31, though the years of hard work had etched lines around her eyes that made her look older. She tended a small garden behind the cottage, where she grew turnips, cabbages, and potatoes. She kept 2 goats that provided milk for the children, and a handful of chickens that scratched in the yard. She could mend any garment, brew a tea from wild herbs that could ease a fever, and stretch a single loaf of bread across 3 days when times were lean. She had been born in the next village over, had married Thomas at 18, and had never travelled more than 15 miles from the place where she was born. Their 3 children filled the cottage with noise and life. James was 12, already learning the loom from his father, his small fingers surprisingly deft with the threads. Margaret was 9, a serious girl who helped her mother in the garden and could milk a goat before she could properly read. And little Ellen was 4, the baby of the family, with curly brown hair and a laugh that Thomas said could brighten the darkest winter morning. Scene. Close-up of Thomas's hands working the loom in the upper room, the steady, rhythmic clack of the shuttle. The camera slowly pulls back to reveal the room, neat stacks of finished cloth, balls of raw wool, sunlight pouring through the wide window. Dust motes float in the golden light. The second room on the ground floor was smaller, used for storage, for keeping the goats during the coldest nights, and for the copper wash tub that Mary filled once a week for bathing. The upper room was where Thomas kept his loom, positioned near the wide window that had been built specifically to give the weaver maximum light. This room also served as the family's sleeping quarters. Straw mattresses were rolled out each night on the wooden floor, covered with heavy quilts that Mary and her mother had stitched together over the course of 2 winters. The children slept in a row, with Ellen always in the middle, and Thomas and Mary lay near the far wall where they could whisper without waking the little ones. There was no running water in the cottage. Water came from the stream that ran past the bottom of the garden, clear and cold, carried in wooden buckets twice a day. There was no privy inside, just a small outhouse behind the garden wall, a wooden seat over a pit that Thomas emptied into the compost heap each month. There was no glass in every window. Some were covered with oiled linen that let in a pale, filtered light. Candles were expensive, so the family rose with the sun and went to bed when darkness fell, except during the long winter evenings, when Thomas would light a single tallow candle, and Mary would mend clothes by its flickering glow while the children listened to Thomas tell stories of the old days. It was not luxury. Nobody would have called it comfortable by modern standards, but it was a home in the deepest and truest sense of the word. It had been built by Thomas's grandfather with his own hands, stone by stone, and Thomas intended to pass it on to James when the boy was old enough to marry. The land around the cottage, though they did not own it, provided what the family needed. The river gave them water and fish. The moors gave them peat for fuel and wild berries in summer. The common land gave them grazing for the goats, and the village, half a mile down the lane, gave them everything else: a church where they were baptized and married and buried, a market where they sold cloth and bought flour, a pub where Thomas drank ale on Saturday evenings, and the company of people who had known the Hargrave name for as long as anyone could remember. Scene. A distant factory chimney appears on the horizon, a thin column of dark smoke rising against the pale sky. The camera holds on this image. The pastoral music shifts. A low, ominous drone begins beneath the strings. But in 1821, the world began to change. Word came to Thornfield that a cotton mill was being built in the valley 3 miles to the south. A man named Mr. Ellsworth, a merchant from Leeds who had made his fortune in the cloth trade, had purchased the land beside the river and was constructing a factory powered by a great water wheel. The mill would need workers, hundreds of them, men, women, and children. The pay, it was said, would be better than anything a handloom weaver could earn. Thomas listened to these rumors and shook his head. He told Mary that no machine would ever match the quality of hand-woven cloth. He said that Mr. Ellsworth's mill would fail within a year, that the merchants of Leeds knew quality when they saw it, that the old ways would endure. But Thomas was wrong. The orders for hand-woven cloth began to dry up that very autumn. The merchants no longer wanted to wait weeks for a single bolt of fabric when the mills could produce 10 bolts in a day at a fraction of the cost. Thomas cut his prices. He worked longer hours, rising before dawn and weaving until his eyes ached in the candlelight, but it was not enough. By the spring of 1822, he had not sold a single piece of cloth in 3 months. The family was living on Mary's garden vegetables and the milk from the goats. Thomas sat at the kitchen table one evening, his head in his hands, and told Mary what she already knew. They could not stay. The loom that had fed his family for 3 generations was now worthless. The cottage that his grandfather had built with such care and pride could no longer sustain them. They would have to go to the city, to Manchester or Leeds or Bradford, to find work in the very factories that had destroyed their livelihood. Mary said nothing for a long time. Then she asked who would tend the garden. Thomas did not answer, because there was no answer to give. By the autumn of 1822, Thomas had sold his loom to a dealer in Halifax for less than half what it was worth. He packed the family's belongings into a borrowed handcart, everything they owned in the world, a few quilts, some kitchen pots, Mary's Bible, the children's clothes, a small wooden box containing their savings, 7 shillings and 4 pence. They walked out through the garden gate on a grey October morning. Mary paused and looked back. She saw the cottage, the garden, the goats standing by the wall, the chimney still trailing smoke from the fire they had left burning because she could not bring herself to let it go out. She pressed her hand against the stone gatepost and wept. She did not know it then, but she would never live in a house with a garden again. She would never again wake to birdsong. She would never again feel grass beneath her feet or breathe air that tasted of rain and heather. Scene: the Hargrave family walking along a muddy road, the handcart between them. The cottage grows smaller behind them. The camera rises slowly, showing the vast green landscape they are leaving. In the distance ahead, a smudge of dark smoke marks the horizon. The music swells with sorrow. The Hargraves were not alone in their journey. Across England, across Scotland, across Wales, hundreds of thousands of families were making the same desperate migration. From the countryside to the city, from stone cottages and thatched farmhouses to something that none of them could have imagined in their darkest dreams. What awaited them in the industrial towns of northern England was not just a new kind of work. It was a new kind of home. And for many, for far too many, it would be a nightmare that lasted not just years but generations. The homes of the Industrial Revolution were not designed for living. They were designed for profit. Built as cheaply and as quickly as possible, crammed into every available inch of land near the factories, they were a monument to human greed and a dark testament to how little the powerful cared about the poor. What those homes looked like 200 years ago, how they were built, how they smelled, how they felt to live in, how they shaped the bodies and minds and spirits of the people trapped inside them, is a story that deserves to be told. Because it is a story that shaped the modern world. And it is a story that has never really ended. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one, real, forgotten, and deeply human, are what we bring to life here every single week. If you believe that history's most important lessons come from ordinary people, not kings, then subscribe now so you never miss a single one. Scene: dense, narrow streets of a northern English industrial town. Manchester, 1823. The camera moves at street level through a labyrinth of alleys and courtyards. Rows upon rows of identical brick houses stretch in every direction, their walls blackened with soot. The sky is a permanent grey, heavy with the smoke of 100 factory chimneys. A woman carries a bucket of water through a puddle of filth. Children sit on a doorstep, their faces smudged and their clothes ragged. The sound of machinery throbs in the background, relentless and mechanical. When the Hargrave family arrived in Manchester in the spring of 1823, Thomas stood at the edge of the district called Ancoats and simply stared. In all his 35 years he had never seen anything like it. He had never seen so many buildings packed so closely together, so many chimneys belching smoke, so many people crowded into so small a space. The streets were narrow, some barely wide enough for a handcart to pass through, and they were slick with mud and worse, a dark, foul-smelling muck that clung to shoes and the hems of skirts and never seemed to dry. The houses rose in long, unbroken rows, each one pressed flush against the next like bricks in a wall, stretching from one end of the street to the other without a single gap, without a garden, without a tree, without a blade of grass. The bricks were dark, not the warm red of new-laid masonry, but a deep, grimy brown, stained by the soot that poured ceaselessly from the factory chimneys and settled on every surface like a second skin. The windows were small and few, some with cracked glass, some with no glass at all, stuffed with rags or paper to keep out the worst of the cold. The doors were thin, warped by damp, and opened directly onto the street, with no porch, no step, no buffer between the private misery inside and the public squalor outside. Thomas turned to Mary and saw the horror in her eyes. Little Ellen clung to her mother's skirt, bewildered by the noise and the crowds and the terrible smell. James, the eldest, stood rigid, his jaw set, trying to look brave. Margaret held her father's hand and said nothing. Their new home was what the landlords called a back-to-back house. It was a type of dwelling that had been invented specifically for the industrial poor, designed not for comfort or health or dignity, but for maximum profit on minimum land. The concept was brutally simple and devastatingly effective. 2 rows of houses were constructed, sharing a single back wall. Each house therefore had windows and a door on only one side, the front. There was no back door, there was no rear window. There was no through ventilation of any kind. The air inside was trapped, heavy and foul, recycling endlessly the smells of cooking, of unwashed bodies, of damp plaster, of the cesspool that festered in the narrow courtyard behind the row. Scene: interior of the Hargraves' new home. The camera enters through the front door into near darkness. A single small window admits a grey, filtered light. The walls are bare brick, glistening with moisture. The floor is uneven brick, cold even through shoes. The room is tiny. A woman could stand in the center and touch both side walls with her outstretched arms. A small fireplace sits cold and empty. A steep, ladder-like staircase rises to the upper floor through a hole in the ceiling. The Hargraves' house had 2 rooms. That was all. 2 rooms for 5 human beings. The ground floor measured roughly 12 feet by 12 feet, no larger than the kitchen alone had been in their Yorkshire cottage. This single room served as the kitchen, the living room, the dining room, the washroom, and the workroom. The floor was bare brick, uneven and perpetually cold. Even in summer, the chill seemed to rise from the earth beneath. The walls were thin. Many back-to-backs were built with just a single course of brick, and in winter they wept with condensation. A constant slick of moisture that encouraged mold to bloom in every corner, black and green patches that crept across the plaster like a slow disease. There was a small fireplace, but coal was expensive, far more expensive than the peat Thomas had cut for free from the moors back home. The chimney drew poorly, filling the room with smoke that stung the eyes and coated everything with a fine grey film. The family cooked on this fire, ate beside it and huddled around it on winter evenings, but it never truly warmed the room. The cold was a permanent resident, as constant and unwelcome as the damp. The upper room was the same size, reached by a staircase so steep it was essentially a ladder with pretensions. This was where the entire family slept. Thomas and Mary on one side, the 3 children on the other, all sharing a single mattress stuffed with rags and straw that Mary had gathered from the streets. There was no wardrobe, no chest of drawers. Clothes hung from nails driven into the wall. The ceiling was so low that Thomas could not stand fully upright near the edges of the room. At night, the sounds of the neighbors came through the thin walls with devastating clarity. Every argument, every cry, every cough, every intimate moment, a symphony of human misery that played on repeat until dawn. There was no running water inside the house. The nearest pump was at the end of the street, shared by every household on the row, sometimes by 200 people or more. Mary would rise before dawn each morning, in darkness and in all weather, to join the queue for water. She carried it back in a heavy wooden bucket that weighed nearly 30 pounds when full, balanced on one hip, slopping over with every step, leaving bruises on her hands that never quite healed. In summer, the pump sometimes ran dry by mid-morning. In winter, it sometimes froze solid. Scene: Mary at the water pump, dawn barely breaking. A line of women and children stretches down the street. Their faces are drawn. No one speaks. The camera lingers on Mary's hands wrapped around the pump handle, knuckles white, veins standing out beneath chapped skin. There was no toilet inside the house either. The family shared an outdoor privy with 11 other households, a total of perhaps 50 people using a single wooden bench with a hole suspended over a brick-lined pit. The privy sat in the narrow courtyard behind the row, accessible only through a dark, narrow passage between buildings that flooded with sewage whenever it rained heavily. The pit was supposed to be emptied regularly by the night soil men, but in practice it was emptied only when the smell became so overpowering that even the landlord's agent, who visited quarterly to collect rent, could not ignore it. Sometimes this meant once a month, sometimes less. The smell. That is what every written account of Industrial Revolution housing mentions first. Before the darkness, before the cold, before the overcrowding. The smell was everywhere, and it was inescapable. It rose from the cesspools and the outdoor privies. It rose from the open drains, little more than shallow channels that ran down the center of the streets, carrying a sluggish mixture of human waste, kitchen slops, factory discharge and rainwater. It rose from the River Irwell, which had once been a clear stream full of fish and was now a thick, black, poisonous flow that smelled of chemicals and decay. It rose from the bodies of people who had no means to wash properly, who worked 14 hours a day in airless factories and came home to airless houses, whose clothes were never fully clean, whose skin was never fully free of soot and sweat and grime. Friedrich Engels, the German philosopher who visited Manchester in 1842 and documented what he found with horrified precision, wrote that the stench in some working-class neighborhoods was so powerful, so nauseating, so utterly overwhelming, that a person of comfortable means could not have endured it for a single hour. He described streets where the accumulated filth of years lay in heaps against the walls. He described courtyards where pools of stagnant sewage stood ankle-deep. He described cellars where the air was so thick with fumes that a candle flame burned dim and blue. But the Hargraves endured it. They endured it because they had no choice. The rent for their back-to-back was 2 shillings and 6pence a week, nearly a quarter of Thomas's wages at the Ellsworth Mill. They could not afford better. They could not afford to move. They were trapped, as surely as if the walls of that tiny house were the walls of a prison. And they were not the worst off, not by far. Below them, beneath the ground floor of the houses, lived even poorer families in what were known as cellar dwellings. These were rooms dug into the earth beneath the back-to-backs, with ceilings so low that a grown man could not stand upright, with floors of packed dirt that turned to mud when it rained, with tiny windows at street level that admitted almost no light and served mainly as channels for rainwater and sewage to pour in from the street above. These cellars flooded regularly. They were dark at midday. They were cold in every season. And they were home to thousands upon thousands of people. In Manchester alone during the 1830s, an estimated 40,000 human beings lived in cellar dwellings. Entire families were born, raised, lived their entire lives, and died without ever having had a home above ground. Scene. The camera descends into a cellar dwelling. Stone steps, slick with moisture, lead down into near total darkness. A shaft of weak light falls from the street-level window. A family huddled around a small fire, their faces barely visible. Water trickles down the walls. The camera holds, unflinching. The children suffered most of all. In the countryside, Thomas's children had run through open fields, breathed clean air, drunk clear water, eaten vegetables from their mother's garden. In Manchester, they worked 12-hour shifts at the mill, their small fingers threading bobbins in the deafening clatter of the machines, their lungs filling with cotton dust hour after hour. They came home to a room with no light, no space, and no clean water. They ate whatever Mary could afford, which was mostly bread and potatoes, sometimes with a scraping of dripping or a cup of watered-down milk. Meat was a luxury the family saw perhaps once a month. The youngest, little Ellen, with her curly brown hair and her laugh that had once brightened the darkest winter morning, developed a cough in her first winter in the city. It started small, a dry tickle that made her scrunch up her nose. But it grew. By January, it was a deep, rasping bark that woke the family at night. By February, there was blood on her pillow. Mary tried everything she knew, warm compresses, herbal teas, keeping the child close to the fire. But the damp walls and the coal smoke and the bad air and the malnutrition were more powerful than any mother's love or any folk remedy. Ellen died in the spring of 1825. She was 6 years old. She died in her mother's arms, in the upstairs room of a back-to-back house in Ancoats, with the sound of factory machinery thudding through the thin walls like a mechanical heartbeat that would never stop. Scene. Mary sitting by the small window, holding a child's wool shawl pressed against her face. Her eyes are open but unseeing. The camera holds on her hands, rough and cracked and red. Silence, except for the distant rhythmic thud of the factory engines. The light in the room is grey and flat and merciless. Ellen was buried in a common grave in a churchyard that was already so overcrowded that the earth itself seemed to heave and shift. The family could not afford a private plot. There was no headstone. There was no marker of any kind, just a name in a parish register, written in a clerk's indifferent hand. One more dead child among thousands. Mary never spoke of Ellen afterward. Not to Thomas, not to the children, not to the neighbors. The women on the street understood. Many of them had buried children of their own. They said that something changed in Mary after that spring, that something behind her eyes went quiet, a light that simply stopped burning. She carried on. She rose before dawn. She fetched water. She cooked. She washed. She worked. She survived. Because that is what women like Mary did. They survived. But surviving and living are not the same thing, and everyone who knew her understood the difference. Drop a comment right now and tell me, what part of this story has hit you the hardest so far? I read every single comment, and your words are the reason this channel exists. Don't hold back. The tragedy of Industrial Revolution housing was not simply that it existed. Poverty has always existed. Suffering has always existed. The tragedy was that this particular form of suffering was new. It was deliberate. It was systematic. And it was enormously, obscenely profitable. These houses were not the result of some unavoidable misfortune or natural disaster. They were not the product of neglect or ignorance. They were built on purpose by men who understood exactly what they were building and why, because it was cheaper to pack working families into airless, lightless, waterless brick boxes than to build them homes fit for human habitation. The factory owners needed labor. Labor needed to live near the factories. And nobody with wealth or power or influence saw any compelling reason to care about what happened to the laborers and their families once the factory whistle blew and the shift was over. Scene: a crowded public meeting in a dimly lit town hall. Gas lamps flicker on the walls, casting unsteady shadows. A man stands on a wooden platform at the front of the room, his sleeves rolled up, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. Behind him, crudely printed posters are nailed to the wall. Clean water for all, decent homes or no peace. We are men, not machines. The year is 1842. The camera pans slowly across the faces in the crowd, men and women both, young and old. Their expressions a mixture of anger, exhaustion, and desperate hope. By the 1840s, the horrors of industrial housing had grown so vast, so visible and so deadly that even the most determined efforts to ignore them had begun to fail. Cholera, that merciless and terrifying disease, had swept through the slums of Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, Birmingham and Glasgow in waves, killing thousands with a speed and a violence that stunned even those who had grown accustomed to death. The disease struck with terrible swiftness. A person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by nightfall, and it struck hardest in precisely the places where the overcrowding was worst, the sanitation most absent, the water most contaminated. The back-to-backs and cellar dwellings were not just homes, they were incubators of epidemic. For years, the wealthy and the powerful had treated the conditions in the slums as someone else's problem, a regrettable but inevitable consequence of progress, the price that had to be paid for national prosperity. But cholera did not respect the boundaries between rich and poor. The contaminated water that flowed from the slums eventually reached the wells and pipes that served the wealthier districts. The disease that bred in the cesspools of Ancoats found its way to the drawing rooms of Didsbury. And when cholera began to kill the children of factory owners and merchants and members of Parliament, the authorities finally, belatedly, reluctantly began to pay attention. Not out of compassion for the poor, not out of moral outrage, out of fear for themselves. Thomas Hargrave was 54 years old in 1842, and he had survived more than most men of his class and generation could have been expected to survive. He had survived the destruction of his livelihood as a weaver. He had survived the move to Manchester and the shock of industrial life. He had survived cholera, which had swept through his street in 1832, killing 3 families on his row alone. He had survived the death of his daughter Ellen, a wound that had never healed and never would. He had survived 20 years of 14-hour days at the Ellsworth Mill, standing at a machine that roared and shook and filled his lungs with cotton dust from the moment the whistle blew at 6 in the morning until it blew again at 8 at night. Scene: Thomas at the end of his shift, walking out of the factory gates. His shoulders are stooped. His face is grey with exhaustion and dust. He coughs, a deep, wet, rattling cough that bends him double. Other workers stream past him, men, women, children, all of them moving slowly, like people walking in their sleep. His hands, once skilled enough to weave the finest cloth in Yorkshire, were now scarred and stiff, the joints swollen, 2 fingers on his left hand permanently crooked from an accident with a spinning frame 5 years earlier. His lungs were thick with the accumulated dust of 2 decades, and he coughed constantly, a sound that had become so familiar to his family that they no longer noticed it, the way one stops noticing the ticking of a clock. His hair had gone grey. His teeth were mostly gone. He moved like a man 20 years older than he was. But Thomas Hargrave was alive, and more than that, he was angry. A slow, deep, abiding anger that had been building in him for years, layer upon layer, like the soot that accumulated on the walls of his house. He had joined a workers' association, one of the many such groups that were forming across the industrial north, despite the efforts of factory owners and the government to suppress them. The association met every Thursday evening in the back room of a public house on Oldham Road, a cramped, smoky space where men crowded onto benches and the floor and spoke in voices that ranged from whispers to shouts about the conditions of their lives. They talked about wages that never seemed to rise even as the price of bread climbed steadily higher. They talked about hours that left no time for rest or family or any human pleasure. They talked about the machines that maimed a worker every week and the owners who simply replaced the injured with someone younger and cheaper. But increasingly, as the months passed and the cholera continued to take its toll, they talked about housing. They talked about the fact that their landlords, many of whom also owned the factories, collected rent every single week without fail, but never repaired a broken window, never fixed a leaking roof, never cleared a blocked drain. They talked about the cesspools that overflowed into the courtyards and the streets where their children played, where their children fell sick, where their children died. They talked about the cellar dwellers, those poorest of the poor, who lived like animals underground and died of fever every winter, whose bodies were sometimes not discovered for days because there was nobody to check on them, nobody who cared enough to knock on a cellar door and ask if the person inside was still alive. They talked about how in a country that was rapidly becoming the wealthiest nation on earth, the richest and most powerful civilization in human history, the very people who built that wealth with their hands and their sweat and their health and their lives, the people without whom not a single factory could operate and not a single bolt of cloth could be produced, those people lived in conditions that would have shamed a medieval serf, that would have been condemned as cruel and unusual if they had been imposed on prisoners. Scene: Thomas walking home through the narrow streets at dusk. Factory smoke hangs low over the rooftops, turning the sunset a dirty orange. He passes a group of children playing in a gutter, splashing in water that is grey with filth. He stops. He watches them. His jaw tightens. He looks up at the row of back-to-backs, the thin smoke from the chimneys, the small windows glinting dully in the fading light. He keeps walking, his fists clenched at his sides. In 1842, a government report was published that would eventually change the course of British history, though the change it brought would be agonizingly slow, bitterly contested, and paid for in the suffering of another generation. Edwin Chadwick's report on the sanitary conditions of the labouring population of Great Britain was a monumental work of investigation, running to hundreds of pages, compiled from the testimony of doctors, clergymen, factory inspectors, and the workers themselves. It documented in unflinching and sometimes nauseating detail the state of working-class housing across the nation. The report described houses built on top of open sewers, with floors that were permanently damp and walls that ran with moisture. It described rooms where 8, 10, 12 people slept in a space no larger than a modern bathroom, their bodies packed so tightly that they could not turn over without disturbing their neighbours. It described streets where pigs and humans shared the same narrow alleys, where dead animals lay decomposing in the gutters, where the only source of drinking water was a pump that drew from a well contaminated by the very cesspools it was supposed to serve. Most devastatingly of all, the report documented the consequences of these conditions in the starkest possible terms. In Manchester, the average age at death for a working-class person was 17 years old. 17. Not because people routinely lived to 17 and then died, But because so many infants and children perished in their first years of life, killed by cholera, by typhus, by tuberculosis, by malnutrition, by the simple grinding, relentless assault of living in conditions that no human body could withstand for long, that the average was dragged down to a number so low, so shocking, so fundamentally indecent, that it should have haunted the conscience of every person who read it. The report did horrify many people. It was debated in Parliament, discussed in newspapers, preached about in churches. It led, slowly and painfully, through years of argument and obstruction and compromise, to the first public health legislation in British history. The Public Health Act of 1848 was a modest, cautious, imperfect beginning. It established local boards of health with the power to improve sewage and drainage systems, to regulate water supplies, and to set minimum standards for the construction of new housing. It did not mandate anything. It merely permitted action, and only in places where the death rate was high enough to trigger intervention. Even this modest measure was fought at every step by a powerful coalition of landlords, factory owners, and laissez-faire ideologues who called it tyrannical government overreach, an intolerable assault on the sacred rights of property, and an unnecessary expense that would raise taxes and reduce profits. Some argued, with apparently sincere conviction, that the poor were poor because they were morally deficient, that their living conditions were the result of their own laziness and vice, and that improving their housing would only encourage dependency and idleness. Thomas followed these debates with a mixture of hope and bitterness that sat heavy in his chest like the cotton dust in his lungs. Hope because at long last, the conditions that he and his family and his neighbors had endured for 20 years were being discussed, being documented, being acknowledged as real and as wrong. Bitterness, because he knew, with the hard-won wisdom of a working man who had learned never to trust the promises of the powerful, that laws written on paper in Westminster and conditions endured on the ground in Manchester were very different things. His own house had not changed. The walls were still damp. The privy was still shared with 11 other families. The water still came from a pump that sometimes ran brown and sometimes ran not at all. If this story is making you think about what really matters, about dignity, about justice, about the debt we owe to those who suffered before us, type in the comments right now. Every family deserves dignity. Let's flood this comment section with that message and show the world that people still care about these things. But change did come. It came slowly, painfully, inadequately, always too late and never enough, but it came. Over the next decades, the back-to-back houses were gradually outlawed in city after city. Liverpool banned them first in 1842. Other cities followed, though Manchester, stubbornly resistant to regulation, did not ban new back-to-back construction until 1867, and the existing ones continued to be inhabited for decades after that. New housing regulations required through ventilation, meaning that every dwelling had to have windows on at least 2 sides, allowing air to flow through the rooms instead of stagnating in a poisonous miasma. Minimum room sizes were established. Landlords were required for the first time to provide basic sanitation. The cellar dwellings, those underground tombs where thousands of families had lived and suffered and died, were condemned one by one and sealed shut, their entrances bricked up like the mouths of graves. Thomas Hargrave did not live to see most of these reforms take effect. He died on a Tuesday morning in March 1854, at the age of 62, in the back-to-back house where he had lived for more than 30 years. The cause of death, as recorded by the parish doctor, was consumption, but it was almost certainly the disease that would later be recognized as byssinosis, a chronic lung condition caused by decades of inhaling cotton dust in an unventilated factory. He died in the upstairs room, in the bed where his daughter Ellen had coughed through her last winter. Mary was beside him. She held his hand and did not weep, because she had used up all her tears long ago. Mary outlived Thomas by 3 years. She died in the same house in the same room in 1857. She was 66. The neighbors said she was ready to go, that she had been ready for a long time, that the only thing that had kept her alive after Thomas was the stubbornness that had sustained her through every hardship, every loss, every indignity that industrial England had thrown at her. She was buried beside Thomas in the same overcrowded churchyard, and her grave, like Ellen's, was unmarked. Scene: an empty room. The camera enters slowly through the low doorway. The fireplace is cold. The walls are bare. The single window admits a shaft of pale grey light that falls on the brick floor like a tired benediction. Nothing moves. The only sound is the distant factory whistle, blowing the end of a shift. The camera holds. Silence, then slowly fade to black. But their surviving children carried the fight forward, as the children of the industrial poor always did. James, the eldest, the boy who had learned to weave on his father's loom in a sunlit room in Yorkshire, became a union organizer. He spent the rest of his working life fighting for better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions, and he was arrested twice for his trouble. Margaret married a bricklayer and raised 4 children in a house that was only marginally better than the one she had grown up in, but she made sure every one of her children learned to read and write. And William. William Hargrave, the youngest, who had been born in the upstairs room of that back-to-back house in 1826, who had never known any home but those damp walls and that cold brick floor, who had grown up breathing soot and sleeping in a room where his sister had died, William eventually saved enough money, penny by penny, shilling by shilling, over the course of 15 years, to move his family into one of the new model houses that reformers and philanthropists were building on the outskirts of the city. It had 3 rooms, a small yard, a water tap in the kitchen, a private privy, a window that opened. William stood in the doorway on the day they moved in and told his wife it was the finest house in England. She laughed at him, but she understood exactly what he meant, because she too had grown up in the shadow of the factories, and she knew that this house, this simple, modest, unremarkable house, with its running water and its private toilet and its windows that let in the light, was not just a house. It was a victory. Scene: modern-day Manchester. The camera moves through the streets of Ancoats, which is now a fashionable neighborhood of converted cotton mills, sleek apartment buildings, artisan coffee shops, and design studios. Young professionals walk dogs on clean sidewalks. A blue heritage plaque on a soot-darkened brick wall marks the site of a former back-to-back housing row. The plaque reads, "On this site stood workers' dwellings, circa 1820-1890. A couple in expensive coats walks past without glancing at it. The camera lingers on the plaque, then tilts upward to the modern glass tower rising behind it. Today, 200 years after the Hargrave family left their Yorkshire cottage and walked into the smoke and noise and misery of industrial Manchester, the world those people inhabited has largely vanished. The factories have been converted into luxury apartments. The slums have been demolished and replaced with shopping centres and car parks. The rivers have been cleaned more or less, and the air no longer tastes of coal. The transformation is so complete that it requires a deliberate act of imagination to stand on a street corner in Ancoats and understand that this place, this specific patch of ground, was once one of the most wretched places on earth. But the ghosts remain, if you know where to look for them. In some of the old industrial districts of Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, Sheffield, and Glasgow, you can still find traces of the world that industry built and then abandoned. Some of the back-to-back houses still stand, preserved now as museums or heritage sites, maintained by organisations like the National Trust as a reminder of what once was. In Leeds, a row of back-to-backs on Elm Street has been carefully restored to show how these houses looked and felt at different periods in their history, from the 1840s to the 1930s. Visitors can walk through the rooms that once held entire families, touching the damp walls, ducking through the low doorways, standing in the cramped courtyards where children once played among the cesspools and the ash heaps. The experience is profoundly disorienting for modern visitors. The rooms are so small, the ceilings are so low, the windows are so tiny that even on a bright day the interiors are dim and shadowy. The walls, even in a restored and maintained building, still feel cold and slightly damp to the touch. The staircases are so steep and narrow that descending them feels like climbing down into a well, and the smell, or rather, the memory of it, the faint mustiness that no amount of cleaning can fully remove, hints at the overwhelming stench that once saturated every surface, every garment, every breath. Scene: inside the restored back-to-back museum. A guide leads a group of visitors through the rooms. The visitors look around with expressions of disbelief, touching the walls, peering out the small windows, trying to imagine 6 people sleeping in a room barely large enough for a modern double bed. A woman shakes her head. A man photographs the fireplace with his phone. A child asks why the ceiling is so low. The guide speaks quietly, letting the space tell its own story. Modern visitors often say the same thing when they walk through these preserved homes. They say it with different words, in different accents, but the meaning is always identical. How did people live like this? How did they endure it? How did they raise children here and love each other here and maintain any shred of hope or dignity or humanity in spaces so cramped, so dark, so fundamentally hostile to human flourishing? And the answer to that question is simple and devastating and uncomfortable. They lived like this because nobody with the power to change it cared enough to do so. They lived like this because their labor was valuable, but their lives were cheap. They lived like this because the men who owned the factories and the land and the houses and the machines had calculated, quite correctly, that it was more profitable to house workers in boxes than in homes, and that the workers had no choice but to accept whatever was offered. They lived like this because the market demanded it, and the market, left entirely to its own devices, had no conscience, no compassion, and no interest whatsoever in the well-being of the people who served it. How Industrial Revolution homes looked 200 years ago is a question that reveals something deeply uncomfortable about human nature and about the nature of progress itself. It reveals that progress and cruelty can coexist, not just side by side, but intertwined, feeding on each other, growing together like roots in poisoned soil. A nation can invent the steam engine and the spinning frame and the power loom. It can build railways across continents and ships that circumnavigate the globe. It can create wealth beyond the wildest dreams of any previous civilization. And it can do all of this while simultaneously allowing millions of its own citizens, the very people whose labor makes all of it possible, to live in conditions that are, by any honest measure, by any humane standard, worse than what they had left behind. Scene: split screen. On the left, a meticulous recreation of a back-to-back interior from the 1830s, dim, cramped, a candle guttering on a table, damp walls, a child asleep on a straw mattress. On the right, a modern apartment in the same neighborhood of Ancoats, all clean lines and natural light, a kitchen with granite countertops, a bedroom with a view of the city skyline. The camera slowly zooms in on both images simultaneously, drawing them closer and closer together until they nearly merge. The Hargrave family story is not unique. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand. Thomas and Mary and Ellen and James and Margaret and William were not exceptional. Their story is the story of millions. The weavers of Yorkshire, the miners of South Wales, the ironworkers of the Black Country, the cotton spinners of Lancashire, the shipbuilders of the Clyde, the potters of Staffordshire. Families beyond counting who left their homes in the countryside and found themselves in a world that treated human beings as raw material, to be consumed in the process of production and discarded when used up. The homes they lived in, those dark, damp, airless, overcrowded, disease-ridden boxes, were the most visible and most intimate symbol of that treatment. Built without care, maintained without conscience, endured without complaint, because complaint was a luxury that working people could not afford, and because the consequences of complaining, eviction, blacklisting, starvation were more terrifying than the conditions themselves. But here is the part of the story that matters most, the part that lifts it from tragedy into something larger, something that might, if we are honest enough to hear it, sound like hope. Those people, the Thomases and the Marys and the Ellens and the Jameses and the Williams, they did not accept it forever. They endured it, yes, for years, for decades, for longer than anyone should ever have had to endure anything so degrading. But they did not accept it as permanent or inevitable or just. They organized. They met in back rooms and in secret. They formed associations and unions. They protested, even when protesting meant arrest, imprisonment, or worse. They demanded better. They demanded clean water and working drains and windows that opened and rooms where a family could live without standing on top of each other. They elected representatives who shared their anger. They pressured governments that would rather have ignored them. They shamed landlords who had no shame. And they persisted year after year, generation after generation, with a stubbornness and a courage that is, in its quiet way, one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. And slowly, painfully, inadequately, imperfectly, they changed the world. The housing standards that we take for granted today, clean running water, indoor plumbing, minimum room sizes, adequate ventilation, natural light, insulation, fire safety, these are not gifts from the powerful. They are not the natural result of economic progress or technological advancement. They are victories, hard-won, bitterly contested, paid for in generations of suffering. Every tap that runs clear water is a monument to the women who carried buckets from contaminated pumps. Every window that opens to let in fresh air is a memorial to the families who suffocated in rooms with no ventilation. Every child who sleeps tonight in a room that is warm and dry and safe is living proof that the fight was worth it, that the suffering was not in vain, that the courage of ordinary people can, over time, bend the arc of history towards something that looks, if you squint a little, like justice. Scene. The camera returns to the countryside. The same rolling green hills from the opening sequence. The same valley in West Yorkshire. The camera moves along the narrow lane to where the Hargraves' cottage once stood. There is nothing there now but a tumbled rectangle of moss-covered stones in a field of wildflowers. Grass grows where the hearth was. Foxgloves push up through the gap where the doorway used to be. The sky above is enormous and blue and empty. The camera rises slowly, steadily, until the ruined cottage is a small grey smudge in a vast green landscape. In the far distance, on the horizon, the modern city skyline of Leeds or Bradford glitters faintly in the afternoon light. The music swells not with triumph but with something quieter and more complex, a sound that might be sorrow or gratitude, or simply the acknowledgement that things were as they were. Then the music fades, and there is only the wind. How Industrial Revolution homes looked 200 years ago is not just a history lesson. It is not a curiosity to be examined at a safe distance and then set aside. It is a mirror. It shows us with merciless clarity what happens when profit matters more than people. It shows us what happens when the powerful forget, or choose to forget, that the workers who build their wealth and maintain their comfort and make their world possible are not abstractions or statistics or line items on a ledger, but human beings who bleed and grieve and hope and deserve to live with dignity. And it shows us, if we are willing to see it, that change is always possible, but that it never comes easily, and it never comes from above, and it never comes to those who wait in silence for someone else to fight their battles. The Hargraves' cottage in West Yorkshire is gone now. The stones were carried away for other buildings long ago, incorporated into walls and barns and houses, whose occupants never knew or wondered where the stone had come from. The garden where Mary grew turnips and kept her goats has returned to wild moorland grass, indistinguishable from the land around it. The river still runs, clear again now, over the same rocks where Thomas's grandfather gathered reeds for thatch. But somewhere in Manchester, or Leeds, or London, or perhaps somewhere else entirely, in a house with running water and electric light and central heating and a garden where children play on summer evenings, there lives a family that carries, whether they know it or not, the blood and the legacy and the unbreakable stubbornness of the Hargrave name. They do not know the story of Thomas and Mary and little Ellen. They do not know about the loom in the upper room, the cottage on the moor, the long walk to Manchester with everything they owned in a handcart. They do not know about the back-to-back house with its damp walls and its shared privy and its staircase like a ladder and its smell that never went away. But they are alive because those people endured. And the home they live in today, whatever it looks like, wherever it stands, exists because those people refused to stop fighting. That is the true story of how Industrial Revolution homes looked 200 years ago. Not just bricks and mortar, not just soot and disease and death, but courage and loss and love that persisted in the darkest of rooms, and the stubborn, unshakable, unbreakable human belief that tomorrow can be better than today. If you watched until here, it's because this story truly touched your heart. Leave a comment saying, I watched until the end, so I can get to know you and find out who really loves the stories on this channel. Hit that like button if this story made you feel something real, and share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who has forgotten how hard people fought for the simple things we take for granted every day. Sometimes, one story can change the way a person sees the entire world. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. This channel brings forgotten stories back to life. The real stories, the human stories, the ones that school never taught you but that shaped everything about the world you live in. Subscribe and turn on notifications, so you are always here when the next story drops.